Good morning. My name is Hiba Baroud. I'm an assistant professor in civil and environmental engineering. I have joint appointments in earth and environmental science, and as Andreas mentioned, I'm part of the Institute's executive committee. So some logistic items, since we are really tight on time. So for the speakers, you have 10 minutes for your presentation, and then we will take the questions during the transition. I will give you a sign at 5 minutes, and then another one at 2 minutes. Beyond that, if you see me standing awkwardly in this area, it means that you have gone over time, so you need to wrap up. Other than that, another thing, it's important for everybody to speak to the microphones. So if you're a speaker, make sure you stick to the podium. If you want to walk around, we have a microphone that you can hold. And then for people in the audience who are interested in asking questions, please raise your hand so that we bring you the microphone. All right. With that, our first speaker is Jason Schwartz, a quantitative researcher at Google. Jason.
Thank you. Can folks hear me? Yeah. Okay. So first, I'd like to thank Andreas and Amanda and the other organizers for the invitation. It's a great opportunity to be able to present to everybody here. So my name's Jason. I'm a quantitative UX researcher at Google, and I wanted to talk a little bit about data-driven product development at Google, and then also give a little bit of an overview of the data science roles at Google, because I think it's not always obvious from the outside what it looks like. So I thought I'd start with my own path to Google. My background is biology. I'm a biologist. I started studying vegetative phase change in Arabidopsis, my undergraduate research. And then I studied biophysics of sensory structures in nocturnal hunting behaviors in fish, looking at sort of exactly how physical phenomena were modulated by physical structures on the animal. Then I moved to cognitive and behavioral neuroscience in my postdoc. In my postdoc, I sort of realized that academic research wasn't really the right fit for me for a variety of reasons. But I loved the research, loved analyzing complex systems, explaining complex topics. And so I decided to make a transition over to data scientist. I went and worked at a seed stage startup where I mostly built predictive models, but also did some analytics. And then I've been at Google now for about 3 years as a quantitative UX researcher. So user experience is basically how users engage with the system, with the product. And it kind of has two sides. One side is design, how something looks, feels, how you interact with it, and so forth. And the other side is research. And research is how do people actually interact with things? How do they use it? What's working, what's not working? And so I'm on the research side, but I'm on the data science side of the research. There's also a lot of qualitative research. At Google, I've worked on G Suite, Google Fiber, and then on Google Cloud Platform, which is our public cloud system. So data science roles at Google. First off, this is not exhaustive. It's pretty exhaustive, but it's not totally exhaustive. There are other people doing data science types of work at Google, but these are the primary roles. It's also, these are not official. My descriptions of these roles is not official. You can go to careers.google.com to see that. One thing to point out here is there's only one role here that has a title data scientist, and they've only had that title for about a year. And so they were the quantitative analysts, and they're maybe the closest thing to what you think of as a classical data scientist. Maybe they're really statisticians, and I'll go through that. Okay, so my own role is I'm a quantitative UX researcher. What does that mean? It means that I study user behavior within our systems at scale. My role, we're embedded in product teams, working very closely with the product teams, the engineers, the designers, the product managers, and so forth. And the goal is really to drive informed product decisions. How do they actually use our products? What are they doing? And our goal a lot of the time is to generate hypotheses and to generate knowledge of what is the base level of what's happening there. In general, our background is a PhD in generally behavioral science, but it could also be natural or social sciences. And in terms of coding, Python, R, and then SQL. It's usually Python or R and then SQL. And all of these roles require statistical knowledge as well. I didn't go through exactly the requirements there, but I'd be happy to answer questions on that. So data scientists or the quantitative analysts, this is really a statistician role. So their job is really applying advanced statistics to problems like experimentation, search quality, load projection. They may use black box statistics and machine learning, but a lot of times they really want to understand mechanistically what's happening, so they rely less on machine learning models. And their goal is really testing hypotheses, solving really difficult statistical problems. Historically, they all had PhDs in statistics. That's less true now, but they tend to be in very numerate doctorate. Product analyst is basically a business analyst role. So they basically they develop business-focused metrics, and they work with leadership so that business decisions can be made in an informed manner. So it's really on business insights and generally bachelor's degree, and SQL is their primary toolbox. So at Google, unlike at some companies, software engineers are really the bread and butter of the company, and machine learning models are what any production level model is trained and deployed by a software engineer, which is not true everywhere. But at Google, it's software engineers who actually are doing most of the machine learning work that goes into production anyway. And so they have various sorts of backgrounds. If you're in machine learning, you'd be really focused on C and Python. And then there's the research scientist role, which is really close to an academic researcher type position, but focused on questions that are relevant to Google. So this is developing novel machine learning techniques, developing the next generation of, say, TensorFlow. Also, machine architecture systems. How do we put together millions of machines into a coherent system that can deliver search results in 300 milliseconds across globally? Those types of questions is what those folks are looking at. Generally, very similar to what a computer science professor would have. A PhD in computer science and a substantial publication record. Okay, so I'm going to talk quickly about this role. That's my role, so I'm most familiar with it. So I work on Cloud Platform, which is our public computing system, sort of Google's equivalent to an Amazon Web Services or Microsoft Azure. And what this enables customers to do is build out their entire system, their entire stack on Google. Everything is running in Google data centers. And you can think about what it takes to run a global application. It's extremely complicated. So this system is extremely complicated. Our users are very technical. It takes a lot of different products to make this work. But the question is, so the product teams, when you get to logistics, the product teams are thinking about their product and a couple of products together. They're not thinking globally about how people are solving big problems. And so what we want to be able to understand is how do our customers integrate multiple of our products to solve the really complex problems that they have to solve. And so one approach in one of my projects is basically, okay, what if we can segment all these different users globally? Rather than segmenting within a product, let's segment globally across our entire system. This is a little bit difficult because we actually have a huge action space, thousands to tens of thousands of unique actions. Most of these tasks require, this isn't Gmail where a common task is opening a message, typing it out, sending, 3 steps. A lot of our steps are 10 plus steps that can occur in various orders, and then multiple of these tasks together to solve a problem. And so you can think about the size of this space, action space times the sort of temporal space, is extremely large. So there's a lot of permutations. And so one thing that we've done is, okay, maybe the fine temporal structure doesn't matter. It just matters kind of how much somebody does something and not the temporal structure. And I don't have time to go into the methods, but we're basically using a topic modeling approach. We've tried a couple different approaches. Now we're using a topic modeling approach for dimensionality reduction. And then doing some discrete clustering using various sort of standard clustering techniques, and then also some visualization-focused further dimensionality reduction to sort of explore this. And so here's kind of what we end up. This is sort of a continuous clustering algorithm, UMAP. And so each of these points represents a single user, and pseudonymized user. And what's critical here is that these users are not evenly distributed. They're collected into groups. And so the question is, what can we learn from this? Basically, we want to be able to look closer. This is sort of a global picture of all of our users. We want to understand what's common about users that are in similar places versus far apart, and how can we use that information? So if we take these 2 regions of interest, we can dig in and say, okay, here's a representation of each of those pseudonymized users, where the colors represent different products. And then these are spirals, and they go out in time. So you can kind of look at temporal patterns and also the pattern of usage. So here's one region of interest of users who are primarily using this blue product, along with many of them using a yellow or orange product. And then here's the other region of interest where users are some of them are still using these blue products, but they're also using a lot of the orange product. The orange product is primary for these users. And so really our goal here is to identify common behaviors. What are the collections of common behaviors across our entire system? And then work with the product teams to understand what are the problems that those users are trying to solve, and what are the opportunities? How can we fix our system or make our system better so that all those users in each of these groups can do their job better, where the system becomes easier for them to use? And this is a team effort between researchers and engineers. And Haley actually graduated from the BioSci PhD program about a year ago. Has been working with me on this since. And then a few examples from other quantitative UX researchers, other types of projects that people have. How am I doing on time? 2 minutes? OK. But in general, what our job is to study user behavior at scale, and then express that to leadership, to product teams, to all sorts of people, because people don't, it's really hard to know how people actually use our system. I mean, when you're talking about millions and millions of users, it's not trivial to say that. And a lot of the approach is, oh, really, let's aggregate this down and look at how many users do this and how many users do this. But what you want to do is figure out ways you can do this kind of globally. And then a lot of the job is understanding what are the needs of the product teams, what are the big questions, what are the challenges that they have. And so it's assimilating a lot of information from engineering, from leadership, from the design teams all over, and then basically applying that to studying our system. I mean, I really like the job, but yeah. And so I'll pause here. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to take questions. Or I can talk through these slides. Yeah.
Is it all the users that you get to study, like in your map? Is everybody represented there, or is it a subgroup? And if it's a subgroup, how do you know who's missing?
In this map, it was a subgroup. Yeah, we do study everybody. In this case, it was basically filtered on people who are basically, you have a certain level of usage of the system.
Yeah.
I thought you had a question. No. Other questions?
Sorry. Hi. Can you identify whether the users are the level of expertise for those users or not, and how you can optimize that based on that, whether they're tech savvy or how do they use their product?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's very, well, yes, we sort of can, but it's a little bit de facto. I mean, that is to say, someone who on the first day sets up a Kubernetes set of clusters and load balancer and has an app deployed, they're probably pretty savvy. But the question is, it's a little bit, how do we make it so people can, no matter the level of, well, you have to have a certain level of tech savviness to get this. And it's a great question. There's a lot of work around personalization. So trying to base on what you do, how can we help you think about the next step? And I don't work on that in general, these types of analyses, but I could inform that. There's very different levels of oversight in terms of if you're building something for personalization versus just for improving the system. But the idea is, based on what you're doing, how can we help you build what you might be trying to build? Does that sort of answer your question? Yeah.
So my question was related to that. Has there been any changes to any of the products based on the information that you found? And if so, can you give a good example?
Yes, there have been changes. I don't know if I can actually give an example. I'm sorry. But I mean, a lot of it would be, I'm trying to think of an abstraction. I mean, a lot of it winds up being, well, here's an example of something that I did just this week, which is that people make the assumption that everybody is using, that advanced users, these more technical users, our largest customers, are primarily using direct API calls and client libraries, and they're not using the console, the graphical user interface. And I found that that's just not true. That people, even if they're extremely sophisticated technical user, and they're using client libraries, and API calls and building services, they still have very significant use cases that use the console. And this, so how does that impact the actual product? Well, then we start to think about, okay, well, users are actually using multiple interfaces together. So let's think about how we build a product that brings all those interfaces together, make it easier to go from the console to, say, developing on the client libraries, or hitting RESTful APIs, things like that. So that's one example of okay, let's drive the product in this direction where we're going to integrate all these interfaces and make it much easier to move between them. As of right now, it's pretty hard. I mean, using APIs and client libraries, there's a lot of setup that you have to do. So let's make that much easier, and then also make it easier for people to monitor their API usage from the console. Is that? I mean, it's sort of an abstract example, but.
All right, let's thank our speaker.
Thank you.
Okay, our next presenter is Ken Lau, Assistant Professor of Cell and Development Biology. Okay, I was looking for you. Do you prefer to stay here, or do you want a microphone attached?
Sure, attach.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay, great. It's great that I'm giving this talk following the previous talk because I can skip over some of the introduction because a lot of the techniques that we use is similar. We use UMAP also, for example. And the difference here is that the scale of the data is a little different. So the data that we deal, so let's, Data Science Institute, right? So let's talk about the data. So the type of data that we actually get is molecular level data. So over the past 4 or 5 years, there are different initiatives through the NIH, NCI, and so forth, engage in these data collection efforts. So this is TCGA as well as the CPTAC, and you can see the amount of data that's generated. And a lot of insights has been derived from these data. So how these data is collected in bulk. So you get a tumor, you get a tissue, you grind it up in a blender, right? And then you collect different patients and you try to classify different tumor types, different patients, and try to use this information to predict a prognosis or whether a patient would respond to different therapies. So we're dealing with molecular level data. But the problem with this, so this initiative has been going on since 5 years ago, is that the data is in bulk. So this relates to the previous talk, right? So if you want to study the behavior of individual users of a software, let's say, you wouldn't isolate a geographic region and average out all the characteristics, right? What you really want to do is collect data at the individual level. And this is where single cell resolution data comes in. And nowadays, there has been an explosion of initiatives to map the human body, both in health and disease, as single cell resolution. So these are just some of the initiatives that we are associated with. The Chan-Zuckerberg Initiative, for example, HubMap, and the Human Tumor Atlas Network. So these initiatives are enabled by high throughput technologies where we can profile the transcriptome as well as the proteome at an individual cell level, okay? And each of these experiments, for example, would produce a transcriptomic profile, 6,000 variables, so it's in 6,000 dimensional space, of thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of cells. So this automatically becomes a big data problem, right? So you can think about, you would have different patients, right, different tumors, but each sample, each specimen would produce thousands and thousands of data points in multidimensional space. So this aspect is, so there are two aspects to this. One is a genomic level aspect, where we're trying to get a complete characterization, a complete profile of each cell. And then there's also a geospatial aspect, because these cells exist in a spatial context, exist in a tissue architecture. So for this talk, I'm only going to focus on the first aspect, which is the genomic characterization aspect. Okay, so what we are trying to do is to look at the behavior of stem cells. So you can think about stem cells as these factories to create different cell types of a tissue, right? But a single stem cell can give rise to multiple different cell types. And this is driven by a cell differentiation process. So you can think about this as water flowing down a hill. And the water would go through the path of least resistance, right? So that's how you sort of bias different cell types. And we can use the single cell distributions, the density and the number of cells, to model this cell production, cell generation process. And we have an algorithm called pCREO to do this. And this algorithm, is a high-dimensional data algorithm. So what we do is we build a density-dependent KNN graph connecting all the data points, and we have a smart way to cross this KNN network, okay? And the pathway to cross this KNN network produces a sort of a graph or pathway of cellular differentiation going from stem cell, HSCs, to other differentiation cell type. So let me talk about one application of this. So our lab studies Crohn's disease, which you can think about is kind of like an autoimmune disorder, but autoimmune as in is your body's reaction to your gut microbiome, not necessarily to your body. And the and this disease is anti-correlated to the amount of parasitic infection. So in developing countries, you actually do not get IBD because you have a lot of parasitic infection. But in developed countries, like in the US, as well as, for example, in China and so forth, there's a lot of Crohn's disease. And how the gut senses the parasites are through these cells called tough cells. So the idea for us is really, if we can find a way to increase the number of tough cells, can we sort of modulate Crohn's disease? And we want to do this through a big data approach. So we generate single-cell RNA-seq data from a normal condition as well as a condition where we have increased number of tough cells. And we can look for molecules that are upregulated in these pathways. Okay, so for example, we can group different molecules with different dynamics over these trajectories under both conditions and look at pathways or molecules that are differentially regulated through these different trajectories. And what we identify are these TCA cycle intermediates, where we can use them to treat mice to increase the number of tough cells. Okay? So the key question is, does this affect disease? And what I show you here is we're, again, using this treatment that we discover using our big data approach in an inflammatory bowel disease mouse model. And you can see that we can increase the number of tough cells. And here, what you see, you don't need to be a pathologist to see the disease, right? Here is the disease tissue, and here's what a normal tissue looks like. So in an untreated situation, you have a lot of pathology, but if you have this treatment increasing the number of tough cells, you actually reverse the disease pathology back to normal. So basically, this is a cure for IBD for this particular mouse model. So just to summarize my talk, so there is an explosion of single-cell genomic studies and different atlasing efforts. So there's a lot of opportunities and funding opportunities out there for grants. And the data that are generated by these efforts are inherently big data problems, right? Multidimensional, many data points. And what I think is that computational solutions are high in demand, right? We generate a lot of these data, but there must be ways to analyze this data. And hopefully, we can turn this data into actionable knowledge. Not just knowledge, but actionable knowledge, like I've shown here. So yeah, I'd just like to thank the people in my lab who've done this work, as well as all these efforts, like the H10, as well as the Chan Zuckerberg, for funding this work. Thank you.
We have time for questions while our next speaker is setting up.
For the treatment that you mentioned for mice, you are altering the number of tough cells produced.
Yeah.
How long did that persist? So is this something that would need to be repeated, or is this something that had a permanent effect in changing that?
So the treatment itself is a TCA Krebs cycle intermediate. So you can think about it like a dietary supplement. We keep the mice, on this supplement, and basically it's a permanent effect if you're on it. We have not tried to remove that treatment so far.
One issue I've seen with a lot of these cellular studies is that the data is a lot wider than it is deep. So what strategies are you employing to deal with that problem?
Well, I think, if I can repeat your question, is that sort of the data matrix, right, is not exact. You don't have the same number of conditions as well as the number of analytes that you're measuring. So, of course, dimension reduction is part of this. But I think right now the technology is there now because we're getting single cells that we actually generate thousands of data points as well as thousands of analytes to balance out that data matrix problem.
Hi, right here. Yeah, so you mentioned a plethora of studies. You know, it's just the whole research is exploding. How do you keep track of it, and who does, and how do you leverage, you know, that knowledge?
I think people are so it's still early days, and people are trying to keep track of it, right? So, for example, for the TCGA, there are good data portals that are built such that non-data science savvy people, like biologists, maybe like me, can access it. For this type of data, we are trying to get to that level, but we're not there yet. Especially on a type of data that I have not mentioned, which is imaging, sort of cellular imaging data. There's really no standard or anything out there. But I think hopefully when we have these consortiums so that we can sort of work together to create browsers and data portals where people can access this data. Thank you.
Okay, our third speaker is Maitile Kunda. She's Assistant Professor of Computer Science.
Good morning. I am in the computer science department, as Hiba said. I do research in AI and cognitive science, and I'm going to kind of give you all some nuggets of information about some of the research that we're working on. The kind of broad vision that our research is looking towards is, we really want to, so we study data scientists. I guess that makes us like metadata scientists. And we want to really maximize our species' ability to learn things from data. There are lots of ways to go about this. There's innovating on AI tools and algorithms. Like Jason was describing, they have their team of researchers at Google. So this is kind of core CS research to make these algorithms more powerful and more robust. But we also can think about innovating on human cognitive abilities, and that sounds a little bit funny. How do you innovate on people's abilities? But really, what we're talking about there is education, right? Like we are sort of constantly trying to think about ways to train the next generation of students and researchers, and especially with the explosion of data science all over the place, we need to train lots and lots more people to be able to deal with data and look at it and understand it. In particular, there's a lot of increasing evidence lately for the importance of visuospatial reasoning in STEM education and kind of STEM achievement more generally. And it's not something that we understand very well. Like, we understand how to teach people math. We understand a lot about how to teach people to read and how to teach them to, understand sort of conceptual knowledge. But there has been a lot less, I'm sure none of you ever had a class in elementary or high school that was like your visuospatial reasoning class. How do we teach those abilities? So that's another area that we study. And of course, really, in the end, I think most of us, kind of doing research in data visualization and AI and these kinds of areas, we see this future where we have teams of people and machines working together. People are good at some stuff. Machines are good at a different set of stuff, and what we really want is to put these together into synergistic systems, so we're getting like really powerful, data understanding capabilities. In my lab, our particular take on how to achieve this vision is that we are working towards building computational level accounts in the form of models, these computational models usually, of how people look at and understand data. And I'm going to give you just a couple of examples of the kinds of research that we do. So the first observation that we have sort of made in studying how people look at data is that people do not always act like the way we would think a sensible algorithm acts. And I'll just give you a quick example. So we did a study, I think now it was a couple of years ago, where we asked a bunch of astronomy graduate students to come in and look at a data set that they had never seen before. It was actually from Andreas's lab. It was a data set about galaxies. And so we had these grad students come in, and it was kind of like a mini version of what you would do as a scientist when you collect a new data set. We just had them coming in for an hour. But we said, look, and we didn't really give them any instructions as to what they were looking for. It was kind of, just to see what's what in this data. And we watched what these astronomers were doing. And they were using a visualization tool, which I think you'll hear more about later today, called filter graph. And it just enabled, they're just kind of looking at plots of data, mostly scatter plots, X, Y axes. So here's an example of a temporal sequence of plots from one of our sessions. So this is starting at the top left and going across, each row by row. And this is just a kind of a quick, this is just a sampling of what happened in this full hour-long session. But if you look at these plots, so imagine you're a computer scientist and you're writing like a search algorithm to look through a data set for interesting patterns. If your algorithm produced this result, there's something like a little funny about it. Like you would almost say, oh, my algorithm has a bug in it. I need to fix it. Like anybody know what I'm talking about? Can anybody? Yeah. Yeah, like you see this, our participant here, they kept going back to this one XY pair. And they would go look at other stuff for a while, and then they would come back and look. So from a algorithmic search perspective, in like, kind of a traditional search sense, this is sort of irrational, right? Like why waste time looking at something that you've already seen before? And this wasn't something that we just saw once in our human study. We actually saw it over and over again. And this is just an illustration of one of the sessions in our study. So here, the y-axis was just our sort of listing of which XY pair they were looking at. And then the x-axis is time over the course of about an hour. And so basically, any time the dots go back down, going from left to right, is when they're returning to a previous plot that they saw. And like I said, we saw this in every single session that we had. So why are people going back? Like, what value is there to going back to something you've already seen? I don't know. I'm actually not going to give you the answer because we don't know yet. But we think, clearly it's a useful thing to do. And I think there's been a lot of research in, kind of human web search and things like that about the history of what you see influences how you're interpreting the next thing that you're looking at. And, our short-term visual memory plays a role here. Like sometimes maybe, if you're comparing something that you saw previously to something that you're looking at, you need to go back and check it again. So part of our work in this area is building a computational model that also uses visual memory and kind of, interprets what it's seeing in terms of what it just saw to kind of understand what is the informational value provided by this kind of behavior. Okay, the second observation I will talk about is that people have a lot of specialized mental machinery to think in 2 dimensions. So we know, so in data science, a lot of our visualizations are 2-dimensional. We're very good, humans are very good at picking out patterns in 2D scatter plots. But of course, some of the challenges that we're facing now is that we have a lot of data that's has a lot more than 2 dimensions. So we can see a pattern in 2 dimensions. What about 4 dimensions, or 8, or 20, or 100 dimensions? Like, how can we sort of look at that data with the same level of ability? So this, this is just an image from a classic neuroscience study in a non-human primate, showing that our brains, the neurons in our brains are actually organized, to kind of reflect the 2D pattern of the world. So, we have this, it's a, kind of innate sort of biological basis for thinking in 2 dimensions. But also we get a lot of training to deal with 2D visual information. And if you think about, when you're looking at a scatter plot, what training have you had to pick out patterns in that plot? It's an interesting question. And it's not just all the previous plots you've looked at. In fact, you've had a lifetime of experience looking at the world and understanding shapes and objects and categories, and you're bringing all of that into when you're looking at a data visualization. And so, it's kind of a little bit different than, if we were going to build a deep network to sort of pick out visual patterns, we would maybe just, show it 1 million scatter plots and say, here's some. But that's not how people do it. So in another project, we've been working with developmental psychologists who have been doing some really innovative work at Indiana University and you know, lots of people are doing this now also, where they put head cameras on babies. It's kind of an interesting way to get like a baby's eye view of the world. Like this is the visual training data that the human mind gets, like early on. And you get these really like funny kinds of videos, like so here's, you know, like this is like the learning input, you know. And so we are kind of using that data, and also we've been collecting some of our own. So this is just an example of kind of like a more controlled data set of object transformations. And then we've been trying to train neural networks to pick out kind of like, you know, how can you have a machine sort of learn visual patterns from this kind of very naturalistic data. And the next step would then be, you know, given AI systems that have been trained on this kind of data, maybe you just give them a little bit of additional training to understand scatter plots, and then will you get, you know, much richer sort of pattern recognition abilities in, you know, with sort of, you know, artificial data visualizations. So I'll wrap it up there. So this work has been really spearheaded by Dr. Fernanda Elliott, whom Andreas mentioned earlier, is one of the new DSI postdoctoral fellows. We've also had some great undergraduate students, and this work is also a collaboration with Professor Kayvon Stessen in astronomy here. I will end there.
Questions?
Hi, that was fascinating in terms of where this research is going. My question was trying to understand the link between what you'd said and what you communicated later on, which is the first part was, can we link the human ability with the computational ability of data science, bringing in from computers? But towards the later end, we were kind of seeing that you're trying to train computers as to think as human beings. I'm just trying to find the link between there. Is it better to have these two streams go separate and merge them towards the end, or is it better to have them merged from the beginning and then develop? Because I'm just worried maybe computers then have the same pitfalls that we have in visualizing data, right? So I'm just trying to understand broadly. It's more a philosophical question, but I guess, yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. And, you know, I think maybe a way to describe, so you're right, you know, like we don't necessarily want to just build computers to mimic people completely, because we already have people. And so I think a better way to frame the research question that we're asking is how do certain kinds of experiences lead to certain kinds of abilities? So we want to understand that in people. And then if we understand that in people, I think there's two routes to sort of, you know, kind of making jumps in data science. One is, I mentioned at the beginning, the education piece. Like if we understand that this kind of visuospatial training helps people learn these pattern sort of abilities, can we start to like structure new educational experiences to help students learn that? And I think, you know, kind of following this, I don't think that the educational experiences ought to all be looking at data plots. You know, I think some of it might be, how do you teach these sort of real world reasoning abilities so they translate? And then the second piece is, if we understand how that works in people, and we understand where the limitations come from, can we then build algorithms that don't have those limitations? So for example, if people are learning from 2D visual experience to be very, very good pattern recognizers in 2D, this is kind of like my far out idea, but can we build like a 8D world where we have algorithms running around and playing with 8D objects and learning these sort of rich relationships? And then, you know, you give them an 8-dimensional data set and they're like, there's the patterns.
Wonderful work. I'm curious, you brought this idea that somehow we humans have an innate ability to distinguish or perform better on the Cartesian space, which is what the two-dimensional presentations are. But are you making sure that you're not biasing this based upon, because cognition is dependent upon a reinforced learning where people come from. I mean, the color studies have shown that the societies who are more into verdant space, they tend to prefer green and they have a better sense to distinguish one green from the other. But the urban people fail to begin that. And then there are a whole bunch of colors who exist in our imagination, but physics defies them. So as you are extending this study, are you trying to distinguish between the untrained learners versus the trained learners? Is the dimensionality a part of our training the way we have been looking into the Cartesian space, or what would happen into primitive non-urban societies?
You know, that's a great question. So I think a couple of answers. So one is, I agree completely. I think, and in fact, I think in psychology and developmental science, I think we have very little idea of, at a computational level, how do things like cultural upbringing really affect our cognitive ability. So that is something that we're really interested in. Like even the idea that we scan primarily from left to right, it's like a learned ability, like you said. And it's in cultures where reading goes left to right, that you kind of develop that attentional bias. So we're definitely interested in studying those mechanisms. Another area that we are looking at quite a bit is what happens when you have people who have atypical cognitive ability. So we're focusing on visual just because, it's maybe, in a way, the 2D visual spatial area for us is like our first case study. And then we might think about, well, what if you have somebody who's blind? They probably have very different pattern recognition abilities. So there's like a lot of, there's a lot of spatial reasoning they can do, but it's sort of haptically grounded. We also do some work studying people with autism who often have superior visuospatial abilities. And so, like, where do those abilities come from, and what might that enable them to do? So I think those kinds of questions are, kind of understanding individual variations. And like you said, like, what is the, these differences among learners is really critical, I think, yeah.
I know we have more questions.
Very interesting research on the visual spatial learning. I had for the first observation you mentioned where there was a graph, people going back to the XY pairs. I noticed like initially there's kind of a linear trend and then it's going back after a certain time period. So I was curious if that has implications or why after a certain period that was common across groups.
I see. So we have not yet sort of done that level of analysis to where, and our initial study was quite small also, to be honest. And so I think that, eventually, I think it would be great to be able to get like sort of big data on these kinds of behaviors, and then we would be able to understand those subtle trends a little bit better. Yeah.
Okay, in the interest of time, I know there are more questions, but we need to move to our last speaker. Gautam Biswas. He is the Cornelius Vanderbilt Professor of Computer Science.
Good morning. So after these very interesting talks, especially Maithili's on human cognition, I'm going to go to a more boring topic. I'm going to talk about control of engineering systems. So I'm going to talk about the work that we have been doing with Vanderbilt plant tops on understanding building operations. They're providing us with a lot of data on Vanderbilt buildings, and we are trying to determine how we can learn from this data and come up with methods by which we can reduce the energy consumption of buildings. So the particular machine learning method that we've been using is reinforcement learning, which again has its links to human behavior. I'll discuss that a little later. I'd like to acknowledge the funds that we are receiving from Vanderbilt plant ops to support this project. In particular, I'd like to thank Darren Bevel, who has been working very closely with us, helping us understand how heating and cooling systems in buildings work, helping us interpret the data that Vanderbilt has collected. I also would like to acknowledge my two graduate students who are doing most of the work. They are here in this room, Abhishek Nag and Ibrahim Ahmed, and more recently, Marcos Quinones, who's a professor in Cuba, has been spending some time with us and is working with us on this particular project. So why deal with buildings? It's very well known that large buildings in urban areas consume about 30% of the electricity generated worldwide. And with increased urbanization, increase in these number of large buildings, this percentage is likely to increase. So since sustainability, reduction in greenhouse gases is becoming a real critical problem, trying to reduce energy consumption in these buildings is certainly a positive step. Now, if you look at buildings, if you break things down, about 65 to 70% of this energy consumption comes from the heating and cooling systems of buildings, what are called HVAC systems. So let's dive a little deeper into, what governs this energy consumption. It's clear, right, that the environmental conditions, the weather around the building, influences how much energy it consumes, right? On a hot day, you have to cool the building. The warmer it is, the more energy you need to cool the building, right? Also, right, buildings are not empty shells, they're occupied. So people set temperatures in different zones of the buildings in different rooms, and that certainly has an influence on the energy consumed in the building. The building conditions itself determines the amount of energy consumed, right? So there are different zones. Each zone has different energy requirements. There's energy flow between the zones. So all that influences, right, how the energy consumption. So all in all, this is, trying to model energy consumption in a building is a non-trivial task. Right? People have, though this is a physical system, and we know the laws of physics that govern energy consumption, right? Building these models, building sufficiently accurate and fine-grained models to do good control is very difficult. So people usually use heuristic methods for control. So let's get into it a little deeper. Now the heating and cooling system of buildings are by themselves non-trivial, right? They are made up of many components. Typically what happens is large buildings have one or more air handling units that draw in fresh air from the outside. Then to convert this to say, meet the comfort needs inside the building, typically you reduce the humidity of the air down to around 50%. You get the air temperature of the air to a neutral value, which is somewhere between 65 and 75 degrees Fahrenheit, and then release the air into different parts of the building. But then since different parts have different requirements, there are local heating and cooling units in each part which do the necessary further heating and cooling. And then there are many other components that are part of the heating and cooling systems. So that makes it, as I mentioned earlier, even more complex to come up with, say, physical models of these systems. But nowadays, right, with advances in computing and sensor technology, a lot of data is being collected from these buildings, right? Also, right, energy control would depend a lot on environmental conditions, which are not exactly predictable, right? Things change over time, so we are dealing with uncertain environments, but we have a lot of data that we can collect from the buildings, and then maybe try and design smart controllers that sort of balance energy use versus the comfort, right? So how do we go about doing that? So the traditional method that engineers have used is you collect a lot of historical data, you try to construct some kind of a data-driven model, you use that model to design your controller, you put the controller in the building, and you're done, and you hope that it works well. But of course, with advances in computing, now we could do better, right? So you build a controller, but you continue to collect data from the building to see how well the controller works, right? If your controller isn't working very well, you then use the new data to refine your models or revise your models, right? Go through this process, and you can continually keep improving the controller. So this kind of a method is what's called reinforcement learning. It's motivated by how humans behave. So when we get put in unknown environments where we have to achieve something, initially, doesn't stop us from taking action. So we take actions, observe how effective they are, so we have a goal in mind, right? So if we take actions that tend to get us closer to the goal, we tend to repeat those kind of actions. If not, then we try and avoid those kind of actions. So this is what the whole idea of reinforcement learning is all about. It's learning by doing, right? And it is now one of the most powerful machine learning methods that people have started using. To make a little deeper dive into what reinforcement learning is all about, let's say we have a reinforcement learning controller. What the controller needs to know is what is the current state of the system and the environment, and it knows that, say that it can take a set of actions, and basically what it does is it says, if I take a particular action, right, what's the new state that I'm going to get into, and how good is that new state? So to determine how good that state is, right, typically you define what's called a reward function. The reward function can be multi-criteria. You could have multiple criteria, right, that define your reward. And basically, reinforcement learning involves two basic things. You're trying to learn a value function. So for a particular state, if I take a particular action, what is the reward I'm likely to get? And then, of course, you want to learn a policy. Now, typically, you don't want to be doing very suboptimal control. In other words, you're not just looking at the immediate reward. You want to maximize your reward over a period of time. So typically, you're looking at a sequence of actions, accumulating the reward, and based on that, trying to come up with a policy or what the optimal control action for in a particular state under certain conditions are. Right? So this is reinforcement learning. Reinforcement learning has recently produced a number of successes. Of course, backgammon dates back to 20 years. It's not a trivial problem to solve, right? To design computer programs that could beat humans, because backgammon is a stochastic game, right? It depends on the roll of dice. But then people have used reinforcement learning methods to come up with expert backgammon players that are as good or better than humans. One of the more recent successes, right, done by researchers at DeepMind and Google coming together, was to develop computer programs using reinforcement learning that were as good or better than the best Go players. Go is a very complex game. It has a large board and large number of pieces, so you can form multiple patterns. So traditional machine learning algorithms would take a long, long time to figure out what the optimal moves were, but with reinforcement learning, you've been able to do well. More recently, it's being used in continuous domains. For example, in robotics, say, for example, when robots have to operate in uncertain terrains, right? So they can learn as they take actions. Another very interesting problem is dexterity, right? Robot hands are not known to be very dexterous, but for example, if you did what Maithili said, you collect data from humans handling certain objects, right, and then get the reinforcement learning controller to learn an initial control from that data, and then try and continue to improve it, right, that matches its conditions best, right? So people have started using those kind of techniques. So how have we applied reinforcement learning? So we currently, this is one test case we've been working on, Alumni Hall on the Vanderbilt campus. We have, say, we took data over an entire year for the building, right? The weather conditions for the year, right? The solar irradiance, which was the amount of sunshine at different times on different days in the year. And we also had a sufficient amount of building data, the control settings inside the building, as well as the total energy consumption within the building. So we used a machine learning approach called support vector regression to try and learn the relationship between energy consumed, the current energy consumption, and the environmental conditions. Now, typically this is a very complex nonlinear function to learn. So to make it easier for the support vector regression, what we did was we clustered the data so that we were able to come up with more homogeneous sets and learned the models for these different sets, right, and then use that for reinforcement learning. So Hiba's standing up, which means I'm almost out of time, and I think I'm almost done too. So when we applied this to data from Alumni Hall, if you compare, for example, the reinforcement learning controller's energy consumption versus the one that was from the traditional controller, right, it's clear that what we are able to do is get rid of energy peaks and keep the energy consumption sort of more consistent. When we did the calculations, we get about 2 to 5% savings in the energy control, right? So we are at a point where we have a very stable method for learning this controller. We learn for 2 months, then apply it, then learn again for 2 months, and then apply the controller. So we are going to deploy it in Alumni Hall this summer and hope we do as well or even better because we'll be working with immediate real data. So I'll stop right here. I won't go through my future slides, right? So there's a lot more work, future work slides, but maybe you can ask me questions about it.
Okay, we have time for one or two quick questions.
Well, you have any idea what the energy per capita of people outside of big buildings is versus inside? Maybe the biggest change you could make is get people into big buildings.
I didn't quite understand your...
If we looked at the problem as energy per capita, big buildings may be way more efficient than other places that humans hang out.
That is true, but the amount of energy consumed by big buildings in proportion is quite significant. And since we have the ability to come up with more efficient control, that would be a good place to start, as opposed to situations where we do not have as much control as to how we can sort of regulate the energy consumption in
I
those
guess
spaces.
making them attractive in some way would be recruiting more people to be in big buildings, which would lower energy costs.
That's certainly a good point, right? I didn't talk much about reward functions, right? So that's another way you can provide incentives to people, because in the work we did in Alumni Hall, we also ran an undergraduate project in a smart cities course where these students interviewed the occupants of the building. And the response I got was, yeah, we do want to be energy conscious, we do want to save energy, but we find that we have no way in which we can control. We try and set our settings in our rooms, the temperature settings in the room, but that they don't seem to work as well. So your point is a good one, right? What you could do is, if you empower the occupants to come up with input to how to set the reward functions in a way such that you can then use those to optimize energy consumption, right? You're likely to get more buy-in and sort of probably in the long run, much more energy savings because of the buy-in of the occupants.
Okay, we're going to have to stop here because we are over our allocated time for the short talk. So let's thank again all of our speakers and the audience for the interesting questions. And next we have a session of even shorter talks. So the lightning talks, Lindsay is going to moderate that.